So I was thinking about Memorial Day on this Memorial Day Sunday, part of the weekend. And one of the things I started thinking a little bit about is where I came to appreciate our country a little bit more deeply. I think my family probably, I would say, was like average patriotic, not overly so, but not underwhelming either. Maybe even a little less than some. Both of my grandfathers did not serve in World War II because they were both part of war efforts and stayed home. But one of the things that I recognized in my childhood that really helped me appreciate being a citizen of our country was a friend of my dad's. My dad worked in Center City, Philadelphia for most of his career, and he made friends with this building manager. His name was Andy Bukowski. Andy Bukowski. And he was a first-generation immigrant from Poland. And as an outsider to our country, he loved the United States. He valued this country in a way, I think, especially for me as a teenager, and maybe for many of us, that we don't value because of not having that outside experience. There were opportunities and there were blessings in this country that Andy could never have had in Poland. The story was that Andy had worked for the Polish government and had escaped he wasn't allowed to travel to the United States, but he was allowed to go on vacation to Paris, where he promptly exchanged his return ticket for a ticket to the United States. He was not able ever to go back to Poland because they wouldn't have let him back out. He really appreciated the opportunities. He actually had two jobs in this country. One was the building manager. My dad got to know him, and the other was a nighttime cleaning job in buildings in Center City. He just loved this country. One of my favorite stories about Andy that made me realize what we have in this country was that at one point, Andy's daughter, who was an adult, was allowed to come visit him. They weren't worried that she was going to go back because she had young children and a husband in Poland. So after she came to visit, they had occasion to visit a grocery store. And she became irate with him when she walked inside. She accused him of manufacturing this pretend store, because she couldn't imagine a store where you could just walk in and buy whatever you wanted. At that point in Poland, they were still standing in line for basic staples. She thought that Andy had spent all of his money to pretend that this is what the United States was like. So Andy took her to another grocery store. And another one, until she realized that this is what America is like. That struck me as a child, because you just take for things like that for granted. And in fact, it started me thinking about many of the freedoms and rights that we have as citizens. The difference, by the way, I looked up between a freedom and a right is that a freedom is an opportunity to do what you want. A right is something the government actually works to make sure that we have. So like I went back and read the Bill of Rights. And some interesting things in the Bill of Rights. If you haven't read it in a while, it's good to review. In the First Amendment, the freedom of religion, that we can freely gather together here in worship, is one of those rights. Also in the First Amendment, speech and press, freedom in those areas as well. Freedom of assembly, freedom to petition the government to make changes are all rights that we have. The Second Amendment, the second of the Bill of Rights, the right to bear arms, that is sometimes wrestled with exactly what that means. The third of the Bill of Rights, much more present back in their day, the freedom that we need not necessarily quarter troops in our homes, was something they were concerned about. Then the fifth through the eighth of the Bill of Rights, which all regard our legal system and the rights that we have there, including the right to own property. And I love that by the time they got to the ninth of the Bill of Rights, they threw in one more, and those other rights which are not generally acknowledged in this document, but which are also rights that we have. They wanted to get a catch-all in there. And so I started thinking about some of those rights, those things that we take for granted. The right to an education. The fact that in our country it is illegal not to have a child receive an education, where it's exactly the opposite or very difficult for a child to have an education in other places in the world. Or the freedom to love whoever we want and marry whoever we want. In some countries, this is not allowed, or culture does not allow it. But we have that freedom. The freedom of utilities that, we just kind of take for granted, that we can turn the tap and have water come out, or plug something in and we have electricity, or things like internet. These are not available in many places in the world. Or the ability to travel, both travel within our country or outside of our country, is unknown and limited in many places, and the ability to get on a road or pick up public transportation is unknown in many parts in the world. That we have an economic freedom, that you can walk into a grocery store and they have all manner of things, that's not the case in many places in the world. That we have the freedom to join groups and be part of political parties and have that freedom to connect with others is not available in many places. Quite a lot of freedoms and rights that we have. So I started thinking about those, and then how our faith applies to this, how our faith might speak to this. And I wanted to share and wrestle just a little bit with a scripture passage that speaks to these freedoms. It's found in the book of Galatians. Galatians is a letter that an early follower of Jesus named Paul wrote to the ancient city in Galatia. But it's unusual in its tone and its manner. Of all the letters that Paul wrote, it seems that Paul is most frustrated with the Galatians. They seem to be abusing the privileges that they have, and so he's pretty harsh and challenges them. And this passage is found amongst those challenges, where Paul, in the 5th chapter, says to the Galatians, "For you were called to freedom." What a great thought, that we're called, we're invited, we're challenged to freedom. I particularly love that phrase because the ELCA National Youth Gathering, I think, I'm trying to remember what year, 91 I think it was the first ELCA National Youth Gathering. Our kids are cycling up to go next summer, where they'll be together with 40,000 other youth, the Lutheran youth. The first one of those that I was ever at had this theme. It was called Called to Freedom. And then that passage continues, "You are called to freedom, brothers and sisters, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence." Don't let that freedom let you get into doing things that you should not, but through love become slaves to one another. It's really interesting what he does in that passage. He reminds us that we are free in Jesus. In God's love for us, we are free, not under the bondage of the laws that the Jewish people in particular, that we are free in Jesus. But make yourself a slave to love, Paul writes. Do you see what he does? We are free, but we voluntarily make ourselves slaves to love and serve others. He goes on to describe, for the whole law is summed up in a single commandment: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. A great reminder. He actually goes on as he kind of expounds on this a little bit, and he reminds them that if they engage in this self-indulgence, they would move on to what Paul describes as the works of the flesh. And they're not a good list. Fornication, impurity, licentiousness, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, anger, quarrels, dissensions, factions, envy, drunkenness, carousing. This is what happens when we engage in the self-indulgence. But he goes on to say that if you are that slave to love, then you live out what he calls the fruit of the Spirit. Much better list. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. These are the gifts when we make ourselves slaves of love. So I started thinking then on this Memorial Day weekend, how could we reflect on some of those freedoms, some of those rights that we have in our country, but do so from within the framework of what Paul challenges us to live as slaves of love. So if you go back to the Bill of Rights, the freedom of religion, that freedom that, again, we have to worship here together, but that unfortunately has also been the freedom to not worship, to not have to have a connection and a relationship with God, which is to our and our society's detriment. I wanted to show you a very short teaching by a very bright guy. He's a professor at Harvard Business School that I found very thought-provoking and challenging, that deals with our sense of government and our sense of faith. I hope you appreciate this.
Some time ago, I had a conversation with a Marxist economist from China. He was coming to the end of a Fulbright fellowship here in Boston. And I asked him if he had learned anything that was surprising or unexpected. And without any hesitation, he said, yeah. I had no idea how critical religion is to the functioning of democracy. The reason why democracy works, he said, is not because the government was designed to oversee what everybody does, but rather democracy works because most people, most of the time, voluntarily choose to obey the law. And in your past, most Americans attended a church or a synagogue every week, and they were taught there by people who they respected. My friend went on to say that Americans followed these rules because they had come to believe that they weren't just accountable to society, they were accountable to God. My Chinese friend heightened a vague but nagging concern I've harbored inside, that as religion loses its influence over the lives of Americans, what will happen to our democracy? Where are the institutions that are going to teach the next generation of Americans that they too need to voluntarily choose to obey the laws? Because if you take away religion, you can't hire enough police.
I thought that was a great reminder of how our faith is directly a part of our type of government. Or I started reflecting on other of the pieces of the Bill of Rights, the freedom of speech and press, that we have that freedom. We have that freedom there that could be a freedom to be abusive or hurtful or slanderous, or we have that freedom to seek truth and to be a blessing in our speech and in our writing. I thought of the freedom that we have to bear arms, which, as I mentioned before, is sometimes a difficult challenge of how to wrestle out the middle point. I found this quote that I thought was particularly kind of humorous and poignant by a gun owner in Minneapolis. He writes, "There's this perception that people are neatly divided into folks who want an M1A1 Abrams battle tank to drive to work, and those who want to melt every last gun and bullet into doorstops. There seems to be no middle ground there, but I know there is. I'm in it." That reminder of our freedom and our being a slave to love. Or I thought of other parts of the Bill of Rights, the description of our justice system, which is excellent, certainly not perfect, but that we have this legal system that we have, and yet it so often seems to be abused, what they typically call frivolous lawsuits in the legal system. I remember a conversation some years back with a lawyer, and he said, you know, a lot of the cases I'm involved in, a lot of the work that I do would just go away if people would just be more loving and forgiving. It would just change our use of the legal system, he said. Or other things in our things that we take for granted as rights and freedoms and privileges. Education. I was particularly thinking about our kids and our teenagers here. I know a lot of you wake up in the morning and, oh no, I got to go to school another day, and that's a challenge. There's kids that can tell you exactly how many school days there are left in school. Well, yeah, and we're not going to talk about teachers. But there's this reminder that this is a privilege in our country. Many kids have learned about the story of Malala as a Muslim girl where she was shot as a female wanting to go to school. I mean, that's how privileged and special that is. You know, when you wake up in the morning and you don't want to go to school, remember what a privilege it is for someone who lives in another part in the world, and maybe take it a little bit more as a celebration and a privilege. Or I thought about the ability to travel and transportation. My wife, one time, as we were traveling in Mexico, or actually on a mission trip in Mexico, she and another person went and traveled in Mexico to go and get formula for a baby that didn't have formula. And it was an all-day process just to get to the store, to get something simple like formula. Or other things on the list that I mentioned, our economic freedom that we have in our country. Again, Clay Christensen has done some really great teaching for those in the business world to remind them of yes, you have a great amount of freedom here, but you also have a responsibility to serve and to help our society, and our faith guides us in this. He has a whole nother video on that topic that's well worth watching. I thought maybe all of these would be well summarized in a wonderful statement by Martin Luther, the reformer that created the Protestant branch of Christianity. In his day, there were those who were abusing their freedom that they were then getting at the beginning of the Reformation. And so he wrote this wonderful, tiny little book. You can find it on the internet, called Christian Liberty. And he starts out with this basic premise that we are one and the same time a Christian who is perfectly free and Lord of all, subject to none, and at the same time, a Christian is a perfectly dutiful servant of all, a subject of all, subject to all. We carry both of these tensions with us.